He was a billionaire, used to luxury, power, and appearances. But one day he walked into a room and saw something that changed his life forever. His mother, suffering from Alzheimer's, being gently cared for by the quiet old butler he barely noticed before. He wasn't doing it for praise or money. He was simply protecting someone who needed him. In that moment, he realized everything he thought mattered didn't. What he did next left everyone speechless, especially those who thought loyalty had no value anymore. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. And don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We'd love to know that. Alexander's mansion looked perfect to anyone who saw it from the outside. It was a massive place with tall gates, long driveways, and expensive cars parked in front. Inside, everything sparkled. Chandeliers hung from the high ceilings, lighting up the polished marble floors. The garden outside was always trimmed neatly with colorful flowers and clean paths. Visitors would assume a happy and peaceful life happened inside, but this wasn't the full truth. Behind all the beauty and silence was a family dealing with hidden problems. Alexander's mother, Mrs. Eleanor, lived there too. She had Alzheimer's disease, and it was slowly getting worse. While the family tried to keep it quiet, her condition could not be ignored for long. Though doctors came now and then, the real care came from Harold, the old butler. He made sure Eleanor was safe, clean, and calm. Even as the household smiled for guests behind closed doors, things were much more complicated and difficult than anyone imagined. Mrs. Eleanor had once been strong, proud, and full of life. She had raised Alexander with care and discipline, teaching him to be successful and respected. But now her memory faded more each day. She would often forget where she was or who she was talking to. Sometimes she asked for people who had already died. Her mind played tricks on her, and this confused her. Some days she was angry and scared. Other days she was quiet and didn't speak at all. Alexander, though busy with his businesses and social life, made sure she had everything she needed, but not with personal warmth. He loved her, but he didn't know how to deal with her condition. He paid people to handle it. That's where Harold came in. Harold wasn't a nurse, but he was kind, patient, and very dedicated. He helped Eleanor eat, bathe, and feel safe. To Eleanor, Harold was not just a worker. He was the only person who truly stayed close to her. Harold had been working in the mansion for years. He came from a simple background and didn't have much education, but he was loyal and careful in everything he did. At first, his job was just cleaning and helping around the house. But as Eleanor's health got worse, Harold started doing more. He read books about Alzheimer's in his free time so he could understand what was happening. He started learning how to speak slowly and clearly, how to calm Eleanor when she panicked, and how to avoid things that might confuse her. His days were long, and he barely rested. Still, he never complained. He believed that care and kindness mattered more than money. Harold knew that Alexander didn't see all he did. He was focused on his business deals, events, and social image. But that didn't stop Harold. Every time Eleanor looked at him with a scared face, he gently held her hand and said, "It's okay. I'm here." And he always was. While Harold focused on caring for Eleanor, Isabella, Alexander's fiancée, lived a very different kind of life inside the mansion. Isabella was tall, beautiful, and always dressed perfectly. To anyone watching, she seemed like the perfect future wife for a rich man like Alexander. She smiled at the right times, gave sweet compliments, and played the part of the loving partner. But deep down, her feelings were cold. Isabella didn't care much about Eleanor. She saw the older woman as a problem, a sick woman who could embarrass the family if her condition became public. When Alexander was around, Isabella acted kind to Eleanor, calling her dear and giving fake hugs. But when they were alone, she avoided her completely. If Eleanor tried to speak, Isabella would ignore her or even roll her eyes. She didn't want to deal with illness. She wanted to be seen as a successful woman with a rich husband, not a nurse in a sad story. The house itself reflected this quiet conflict. Rooms were filled with expensive art, glass tables, and large windows, but they felt cold. There was no laughter in the halls, only whispers and short greetings. The staff knew not to speak much, and Harold rarely left Eleanor's side. Alexander stayed busy with phone calls and meetings, barely stopping to check on his mother. Isabella spent her time planning events, going shopping, or posting pictures online. The house was large, but it felt empty in the places that mattered. Eleanor's room, however, was different. Harold had decorated it with soft blankets, family photos, and gentle lights. It was the only space that felt warm. Sometimes Eleanor would cry, confused by the silence around her. Harold would wipe her tears and say something simple to bring comfort. The world outside might have seen a perfect family and a perfect house, but inside the truth was much different. The silence wasn't peace. It was distance and sadness. As the days passed, this silent tension continued. Alexander still believed he had full control of everything, his business, his image, and his future with Isabella. He did not realize how distant he had become from his mother, or how fake Isabella's love truly was. Harold noticed everything, but he stayed quiet. His focus was always on Eleanor's well-being. One evening, after a long day, Harold helped Eleanor get ready for bed. The old woman looked into his eyes and whispered, "Don't leave me." Harold smiled gently and said, "I won't." That small moment meant everything. Meanwhile, Isabella passed by the room in silence, not even looking inside. She had just spoken to Alexander earlier, pretending to care, asking if Eleanor was improving. He had smiled, proud of how well she seemed to be adjusting, but he didn't know the truth. In the mansion, behind all the beauty and order, one man cared with his heart, another faked her role, and the real pain stayed hidden behind closed doors. Over time, Harold started noticing the true way Isabella behaved around Mrs. Eleanor. At first, it was small things, short answers, fake smiles, or walking away quickly when Eleanor asked a question. But as days passed, it became much clearer. When Alexander was not around, Isabella changed completely. Her tone with Eleanor was cold and rude. She didn't hide her irritation anymore. If Eleanor forgot something or asked the same thing twice, Isabella would roll her eyes and say things like, "Oh, not again," or "You're wasting my time." She spoke harshly, sometimes loud enough for others to hear, but only when Alexander wasn't nearby. In front of him, she still acted sweet and helpful, but it was all fake. Harold watched it all closely. He felt uncomfortable, but didn't know what to do. He knew Isabella was cruel when no one important was watching, and it hurt to see Eleanor suffer. Harold realized that what he once thought was just stress was actually something much worse. Isabella had a way of humiliating Eleanor without using obvious insults. She would speak to her like she was a child, even when Eleanor was trying hard to be clear. "Sit here and don't move until someone comes," she'd say, like giving an order to a dog. Sometimes she would whisper something sarcastic just before Alexander walked into the room, then smile sweetly and pretend to help. It was confusing for Eleanor, who already struggled to follow conversations or remember who people were. The old woman would lower her head, not understanding why Isabella was upset, but feeling the pain anyway. Harold watched Eleanor grow more nervous whenever Isabella was nearby. She started avoiding certain rooms or staying quiet during family gatherings. Whenever Eleanor made a mistake, Isabella gave her a look that said everything: disappointment, disgust, or even anger. Harold felt a mix of anger and sadness. He wanted to say something, but he didn't know how, without risking his job or making things worse. Harold tried to help Eleanor in small ways. He stayed close when Isabella entered the room, hoping his presence would keep the cruelty in check. He would gently interrupt conversations or step in to explain things more clearly so Eleanor didn't feel embarrassed. When Eleanor forgot names or said something strange, Harold would smile and redirect the topic, making her feel safe, but it wasn't enough. Isabella kept finding new ways to push Eleanor aside. She started making decisions about Eleanor's clothes, her food, even her schedule, without asking or informing her. Eleanor felt like a guest in her own home. One day, Isabella ordered the staff to move Eleanor's favorite armchair without asking, just because she thought it looked ugly in the living room. Eleanor didn't complain, but Harold saw the sadness in her eyes. These were not accidents or misunderstandings anymore. Isabella was slowly trying to erase Eleanor from the picture little by little, and Harold knew he had to do more than just watch. The atmosphere inside the mansion changed. There were now two very different worlds inside the same house. One world was the one seen by visitors, full of elegance, order, and luxury. The other world was hidden in quiet corners, hallways, and bedrooms where the truth lived. Harold saw how the other workers started noticing it too, though they didn't speak openly. When Isabella threw a small party for Alexander's business friends, she made Eleanor stay in her room to rest. Harold was told to bring her dinner there and keep her away from the guests. Eleanor asked, "Why can't I join the others?" Harold didn't know how to answer, just said, "Maybe next time." He watched as the laughter from the party echoed through the halls while Eleanor sat alone, confused and hurt. The gap between how things looked and how they really were became harder to hide. Harold was no longer sure he could stay quiet and keep pretending everything was okay. Alexander remained blind to what was going on. He believed Isabella was handling everything well, and that Eleanor was being cared for. He trusted her words more than he trusted what he didn't see. Isabella always made sure to look busy when he was home, bringing calm and tea, asking about her medicine, but these actions were just for show. Once Alexander left, Isabella would toss the tea aside, leave Eleanor alone, and ignore anything she asked for. Harold started feeling angry every time he saw Isabella acting like the perfect daughter-in-law in front of Alexander. It wasn't fair. Eleanor had raised Alexander, supported him, and built that home, while she was being treated like a burden. Harold knew the truth, but he didn't know if anyone would believe him. He wrote down what he saw in a small notebook, afraid that one day things would get even worse. Something inside him told him the time to act was coming soon. Harold finally reached a point where he couldn't ignore the truth anymore. He had tried to stay respectful and quiet, hoping things would change. But it was clear now Isabella's cruelty was growing stronger, not weaker. Eleanor was becoming smaller, more silent, and more afraid every day. Elle seemed to notice what was happening to her. Harold stood in the hallway one evening and watched Isabella scold Eleanor for accidentally dropping a glass. Eleanor froze, eyes wide, clearly scared. Isabella muttered something mean and walked away without helping. Harold helped clean the mess and sat beside Eleanor, holding her hand. "You're okay," he whispered. That night, Harold cried alone in his small room. He knew he had to protect Eleanor, even if it meant taking risks. The house could no longer pretend. The cruelty was out in the open now, and Harold could no longer look away. One afternoon, after Alexander had gone out for a business meeting, Isabella and Mrs. Eleanor were sitting in the living room. The TV was on, but Eleanor wasn't really watching. She stared at Isabella and smiled gently, then called her by a different name. Isabella immediately turned cold. Shh. She looked at Eleanor with anger in her eyes and snapped, "I'm not her. Are you really this lost already?" Eleanor blinked, confused and hurt. "Do you ever listen? Do you even know what day it is?" Her voice got louder. Eleanor shrank back into her chair, frightened and silent. Without thinking twice, he walked over and stood between them. Isabella was shocked that Harold had spoken to her like that. She took a step forward, looking Harold up and down with disgust. "You're just the old Butler." Her voice was sharp and full of pride. Harold stood still, trying to stay calm. "She's sick," he said. "You can't treat her like that." Isabella laughed coldly. "I treat her how I want. You work for me. Don't forget your place." Harold didn't answer. Isabella stormed out of the room, furious. Harold helped Eleanor back to her bedroom and stayed with her until she calmed down. That night, Harold thought about what happened. He'd always known Isabella was cruel, but this was different. It wasn't just hidden anymore. It was open and angry. Harold started wondering how far Isabella would go to get what she wanted. The next few days were tense. Harold avoided Isabella when he could, but inside he was getting more and more worried. Then came the night of an important dinner. Alexander had invited business guests over, and the whole mansion was prepared. The table was set perfectly, the lights were dimmed just right, and music played softly in the background. Isabella wore a beautiful dress and greeted guests with fake charm. Everyone thought it was a perfect evening. But upstairs, Eleanor was locked in her bedroom. She had dressed up by herself, thinking she would join the dinner, just like old times. But Isabella had other plans, afraid that Eleanor might say something strange in front of the guests. She quietly locked the door before anyone could notice. Eleanor knocked softly at first, then harder, confused. No one came. Harold noticed something wasn't right, and he couldn't find Eleanor anywhere. He ran upstairs. Eleanor was crying in the dark. Harold helped Eleanor sit on the bed and wrapped a blanket around her. "She locked me in," Eleanor said. Harold felt anger rise in his chest. "You're okay now," he said softly. "I'm here." Downstairs, the dinner continued with Isabella smiling and laughing, pretending nothing had happened. Harold stayed with Eleanor for a while, trying to calm her down. After some time, Eleanor fell asleep. Harold looked around the room. It was too quiet, too lonely. He walked out, closed the door gently, and went back downstairs. He found Isabella in the kitchen, alone for a moment. "You crossed the line," Harold said. Isabella turned quickly. "Don't you ever talk to me like that again," she hissed. "You can fire me if you want," he said, "but I won't let you hurt her again." The words had been said. After that night, things changed in the mansion, but she made sure to treat him coldly every day. She gave him more tasks. Harold did his job quietly, but watched everything more closely. Lenore trusted Harold more than ever. She followed him around the house like a shadow and asked for him when she felt scared. Alexander remained unaware. Isabella kept up the act perfectly in front of him, but inside the house, the silence was heavy. Everyone seemed to feel that something was wrong, but no one said anything. The air was thick with tension. Harold wrote everything down in his notebook each night, hoping he would find a way to speak the truth one day. He no longer feared Isabella. His fear had turned into something else: determination. Harold couldn't leave Eleanor alone in this. It stayed quiet long enough. Something had to change, and he knew it had to start with him. Harold started thinking of ways to expose Isabella. The cruelty had gone too far. Locking Eleanor in a room, shouting at her. Harold knew he couldn't fix this by himself, but Isabella was clever, always acting perfect when he was near. Harold thought about recording her, or showing the notes he had written. But even that felt risky. Still, something had shifted inside him. He was no longer afraid to stand up. Eleanor needed someone to fight for her, and Harold was ready. The truth was close, too close to stay hidden much. The silence was too heavy. The truth was about to explode. The evening was set up to be perfect. Alexander and Isabella had invited several important guests to the mansion for a formal dinner. The dining room was spotless. The table was decorated with fine plates, tall glasses, and silverware shining under the lights. Everyone was dressed in their best clothes. Waiters walked around serving drinks, and soft music played in the background. Eleanor sat quietly at the table, looking calm but a little distant. At one point, she turned to a guest sitting beside her and smiled. She gently touched his arm and said, "I haven't seen you in years. You look just like my brother." The man looked surprised but smiled politely. A silence fell across the table. People looked around, unsure how to react. Isabella's face tightened. Without thinking, she stood up and said, "Eleanor, stop it. You're confusing people. You're becoming a burden." Her voice was cold and sharp. The guests looked uncomfortable. Harold froze for a second, then calmly stood up. Harold took a breath and looked at Isabella. His voice was clear. "She's not being a burden," he said. "She's being herself. She didn't mean anything wrong." The table stayed quiet. Harold stepped closer to Eleanor and placed his hand on her shoulder. "She's remembering someone she loved. That's not embarrassing. It's human." The words hung in the air. One of the older guests nodded quietly. Others looked at each other, unsure but thoughtful. Eleanor looked confused at first, then smiled at Harold. Harold's eyes watered slightly, but he held it in. He smiled back and nodded. Eleanor leaned her head gently on Harold's arm. The moment was honest and emotional. Even those who didn't fully understand Alzheimer's felt something shift. Alexander looked at his mother, then at Harold, then at Isabella, who stood frozen. Something wasn't right, and for the first time, it showed in front of everyone. After the dinner, the guests slowly left. Some said goodbye to Eleanor with more care than before. Alexander walked them out, still thinking about what happened. Back in the house, Isabella was furious. She waited until the hall was empty and then pulled Harold aside into the kitchen. Her tone was low but full of rage. "Don't you ever make me look bad again," she said. "You think you're smart? That you're better than me because she likes you?" Harold didn't speak. He stood still, his heart beating fast, but his face calm. "I'm warning you," Isabella continued. "This house is mine now, and I'll do whatever it takes to get you out of it. But don't think I'll stop protecting her." Isabella stepped back, surprised by the answer. The tension. Alexander returned to the dining room and found Harold helping Eleanor stand up. He watched them quietly. Eleanor was calm, holding Harold's hand, walking slowly but safely. Isabella entered the room a few seconds later and smiled like nothing had happened. But Alexander wasn't fully convinced.
Ow.
The dinner had changed something. attention before, but now his eyes were opening. He also noticed how Isabella barely looked at his mother unless others were watching. Later that night, Alexander asked Isabella if she thought Eleanor should stay with them. Isabella answered quickly. She needs professional help. Maybe a clinic. That answer didn't feel right to him. He started thinking about what life had become in the mansion. Something inside told him he had been ignoring too much. For the first time, he wondered if Harold had been right all along. Isabella avoided speaking to Harold unless it was to give strict orders. Eleanor, though often confused, smiled more when Harold was nearby. Alexander became more distant from Isabella. He watched more carefully, trying to see past the perfect image she always presented. The mansion, once a place of show and order, started to feel heavy and uncomfortable. Conversations were short. Eye contact was avoided. The workers spoke only when needed. At night, the halls felt colder. The truth was getting closer and everyone could feel it. He was preparing. He knew the guests had seen something real during the dinner. The mask had cracked, and that was all it needed to start falling apart piece by piece. She bought gifts for Eleanor, brought flowers to her room, and acted more caring in front of Alexander, but it didn't work. Eleanor didn't respond to her the same way. She often looked past her or reached for Harold instead. Alexander noticed every time. He didn't say anything, but it was clear he was thinking. With Eleanor, quiet around Isabella, and respectful to Alexander. The house felt like it was holding its breath. The smallest action could lead to something bigger. Harold no longer hid his disappointment with Isabella. His silence was stronger than any insult. Isabella, once in full control, started feeling trapped. Her plans were slipping. Every time Harold stood beside Eleanor, she felt defeated. Alexander watched all of it. The calm surface of the house was no longer enough. The pressure was growing. Something had to. What could have been ignored turned into something powerful. Isabella's reaction had revealed her true feelings. Harold's defense had shown his true heart, and Eleanor's soft words, calling Harold her son, had opened the eyes of those watching. That small moment changed everything. Alexander began to see cracks in the perfect picture. Isabella, scared of losing control, began threatening Harold more directly. The house, once ruled by silence and appearances, now felt unstable. The truth was creeping into the open, no longer hiding in corners. Harold knew it. So did Isabella. They were on different sides now, and the battle between them was no longer quiet. Every day the tension grew. The time for secrets was almost over. The mansion was no longer just a home. It had become a place where truth and lies were about to collide. Alexander had traveled again for business, left early in the morning, reminding Harold to give his mother her medication and telling Isabella to handle things at home. With him gone, Isabella felt more in control. She walked around the house with confidence, giving orders and acting as if the place belonged to her. Around mid-afternoon, she passed by Eleanor's room and heard soft mumbling. Curious or maybe just irritated, she stepped inside. Eleanor sat on the edge of her bed, holding an old scarf in her hands. She whispered names from her past. Names Isabella didn't recognize. Lou, don't forget the roses, Eleanor said to no one. Her eyes were distant. Isabella sighed loudly. Not this again, she muttered. She walked over and grabbed Eleanor's arm roughly. You need to stop living in the past. You sound crazy, she said sharply. Eleanor looked scared. Her hand trembled. She tried to pull away. That's when Harold appeared at the doorway and saw everything happening. Harold didn't hesitate. He walked straight into the room and stood between Isabella and Eleanor. His voice was strong and direct. Let go of her now. Isabella turned sharply. Don't interfere, she said coldly. This is none of your business. But Harold didn't move. She's not hurting anyone, he replied. She's scared. She doesn't even know where she is right now. Isabella rolled her eyes and let go of Eleanor's arm with force. Eleanor leaned back against the bed, clearly shaken. You old butlers think you can speak like equals now? Isabella sneered. Harold stood his ground. Respect is not about jobs. It's about how you treat people. The two stared at each other for a long second. The room was full of tension. Eleanor started to cry softly, whispering something Harold couldn't fully understand. And then, just as the silence returned, they heard the sound of the front door opening. It was Alexander. He had come back early, and he was walking toward them. Alexander entered the hallway and walked toward the noise. He heard voices coming from his mother's room and picked up his pace. When he stepped inside, he froze. Eleanor was crying, sitting on the bed. Harold stood beside her, looking serious. Isabella stood across from them, clearly angry. The room felt heavy. "What's going on?" Alexander asked. No one answered. Isabella quickly stepped forward. "Alexander, I was just helping her," she began. But Alexander raised his hand. "Don't," he said. He looked at Eleanor, then at Harold, then back at Isabella. "I saw everything." He had arrived just as Isabella grabbed Eleanor's arm and shouted. He had seen her frustration, her tone, her lack of care, and now it all made sense. All the tension, the things Harold tried to hide, and Eleanor's fear. "You've been pretending for too long," he said. Isabella tried to respond again, but Alexander wasn't listening anymore. The truth was no longer hiding behind smiles. Isabella's face changed. She knew he meant it. "Alexander, I've been under a lot of pressure. You have no idea how hard this is for me," she said, trying to sound calm. Alexander shook his head. "It's not about pressure. It's about basic decency. You don't treat people like that, especially not my mother." Isabella started raising her voice, trying to defend herself, but Alexander didn't let her continue. "I trusted you. I thought you were helping her, but I was wrong." Harold stayed silent through all of it. He didn't look at Isabella, just kept his hand gently on Eleanor's shoulder, making sure she felt safe. Eleanor didn't say much, but she slowly reached up and held Harold's hand tighter. Alexander saw that. He saw who Eleanor trusted. "You should leave this room," he told Isabella, "right now." Her face turned pale, but she obeyed. She left the room without another word. Silence that followed felt different this time, full of truth. Later that evening, Alexander sat alone in the living room, trying to process everything. The house, once calm and full of routine, now felt like a different place. He thought about all the signs he had ignored. Harold had always been there for his mother, always patient, never asking for praise. Isabella had always talked big, showed off when guests were around, and acted cold when no one was watching. Well, he had seen it clearly now. There was no more doubt. He felt guilty for not seeing it sooner. He walked to his mother's room. She was resting, and Harold was sitting beside her, reading quietly. He looked at Harold and said, "Thank you." He nodded. He didn't need a long speech. His actions had already said enough. Alexander realized that the house needed to change. It's not just furniture or staff, but it's energy, it's people. It needed to be a place where honesty mattered more than appearance. And that change had just begun. The moment Alexander stepped into that room and saw Isabella hurting his mother, everything changed. There were no more secrets, no more polite lies, and no more fake kindness. The truth had finally come out in the most painful, direct way possible. Alexander's silence had been broken. Harold no longer needed to protect Eleanor alone. The household, once full of fake peace and forced smiles, had been exposed. The mask Isabella wore every day had shattered completely. Eleanor's pain, once hidden behind closed doors, was now impossible to ignore. Harold stood beside her, calm and steady, just like always. Alexander saw everything clearly now, and his role had shifted from distant observer to someone ready to act. Isabella's power in the house was gone. The control she held through image and manipulation no longer worked. The mansion, once ruled by appearances, could no longer pretend. The truth had finally surfaced, painfully, but fully. Alexander was quiet during breakfast, barely touching his food. Isabella acted as if nothing had happened. She smiled, drank her coffee, and tried to start casual conversation, but Alexander didn't respond. When they were finally alone in the living room, he stood in front of her and said, "We need to talk now." Isabella sat up straight, sensing something serious. Alexander didn't yell. His voice was calm but firm. "I saw what you did yesterday." Isabella laughed nervously. "Alexander, please. It was a bad moment. I was tired and your mother was confused again." He cut her off. "I ignored it because I wanted to believe you cared. Speak again." But Alexander continued. "This ends here. The engagement is over." His words were final. No, there was no going back now. Isabella stared at him, shocked, her eyes filled with disbelief. "You're ending things over that?" she said. "Over your senile mother and some old butler who acts like he owns the place?" Alexander's face didn't change. "Over your behavior, over your lies, over how you treated the two people who deserved kindness." Isabella stood up quickly. "Everything you did was for yourself. You cared about image, about control, not about love." She tried again, softer this time. "It was just a moment of weakness. Everyone makes mistakes." Alexander looked her straight in the eyes. "That wasn't a mistake. It was who you are." Her mouth opened, but no words came out. One of herself that she showed to everyone had finally fallen apart, and Alexander didn't care anymore. Harold stood quietly by the hallway, hearing pieces of the conversation, but not moving closer. He didn't want to intrude, but part of him hoped Alexander would finally do what was right. A few minutes later, he heard footsteps approaching fast. Isabella stormed past him, grabbing her purse and pulling open the front door without looking back. She slammed it behind her. The house fell into silence. Then Alexander spoke. "Thank you," he said, "for everything, for being there for my mother, for staying strong." Harold looked down, unsure what to say. "I just did what I had to do," he replied. "No," Alexander said. Harold nodded gently. He didn't need praise, but those words mattered. The truth had finally been spoken out loud in that house. Later that afternoon, Eleanor was sitting by the window with Harold beside her. She looked calm but confused, holding a photo of Alexander as a child. When Alexander entered the room, she smiled but asked quietly, "Is she gone?" Alexander nodded and sat next to her. "Yes, she's gone." "Did she want to hurt me?" Her voice was small, like a child asking something hard. Alexander looked at, "I promise." Eleanor seemed to relax a little. Harold offered her a cup of tea, and she sipped it slowly. The air in the room felt lighter than before. There was no more pretending, no more fake smiles. He didn't know what the future would look like, but he knew this was a new beginning. The house finally felt like a home again, a real one. In the following days, everything slowly began to change. Alexander stayed home more often. He helped Harold with Eleanor's daily care and spent time listening to stories from her past, even if they were sometimes mixed up or repeated. Harold guided him patiently. The staff in the house noticed the difference too. Meals were simpler, but filled with real conversation. Laughter returned, even if just in small moments. Alexander started organizing Eleanor's medical care with more attention. He also gave Harold more responsibility, not just as a worker, but as someone he trusted. He asked his opinion, consulted him on decisions, and thanked him openly. Harold was still the old butler, but he had become something else, the heart of the home. He never asked for recognition, but it was clear he had earned respect. Alexander had learned something important. Loyalty, honesty, and kindness were worth more than status or looks. The day Isabella left, everything changed. The truth that had been hidden for so long finally came out in full. Alexander had confronted her, ended their engagement, and refused to accept excuses. Her image, once perfect, had fallen apart, and she couldn't repair it. She left angry, confused, and full of pride. But the damage was already done. Eleanor, even with her fading memory, could feel the difference in the house. When she asked Alexander if Isabella meant to hurt her, his answer was firm and clear. Never again, he told her. That moment was a turning point. Harold, once seen only as the old butler, had become something far more important. He was now the true guardian of that home, not because of his position, but because of his actions. The house no longer followed the rules of appearances. Now it followed the rules of love, respect, and truth. Status no longer mattered. Loyalty was what truly defined who belonged. Isabella's absence brought an unfamiliar peace to the mansion without. Her voice giving orders or her footsteps echoing down the halls. The house felt quieter, but in a good way. The tension that used to fill every room had vanished. Meals were less formal, but more comfortable. Eleanor seemed less anxious, even during moments of confusion. Harel continued his work, focused as always, without expecting thanks. The other staff noticed the change too. No one rushed anymore. People spoke softer. The place that once looked perfect on the outside now felt calm on the inside. Alexander spent more time at home watching how things worked without Isabella around. It was during one of those quiet nights that he walked past his mother's room and saw something that stopped him. Harold had fallen asleep next to Eleanor, their hands still holding each other. There was no performance, no show, just care and peace.
Ow.
That small moment stayed with Alexander more than any speech or gift ever could. That image stayed in Alexander's mind. The next morning, while drinking coffee alone in the dining room, he thought about how different things had become in just a few days. Isabella had made everything about power and image. Harold made everything about care and honesty. He had never once asked for attention, but he had always been present when it truly mattered. Alexander realized he had been too focused on appearances for too long. He had been proud of the big house, the successful business, the beautiful fiancée, and the way others looked at his life. But none of that had value compared to what Harold gave his mother. Real love and patience. Even when things were difficult, Harold never turned away. He remembered all the times he chose to stay quiet or look the other way, thinking things would fix themselves. Now he saw how wrong he had been. The truth had always been in front of him, but he hadn't been ready to see it. As the day went on, Alexander tried to be more present. He sat with Eleanor during lunch, even though she forgot his name halfway through. He didn't correct her. He just smiled and kept talking to her. Harold helped guide the conversation in a gentle way, showing him how to keep things simple and calm. He watched Harold more closely, not in a judgmental way, but with real interest. He knew how to move around the house without disturbing anyone, how to calm Eleanor when she was confused, and how to fix small problems before they grew. It wasn't about training. It was about heart. Alexander saw how his actions came from a place of kindness, not duty. That changed the way he looked at him. He was no longer just the old butler. He was the person who held everything together when he couldn't. He wondered how many days he had wasted chasing status while ignoring the things that truly gave his life meaning. Alexander began to take small steps toward change. He asked Harold about his mother's needs, not in a rushed way, but with real attention. He asked him what routines helped, what medications made things easier, and what Eleanor liked to eat on difficult days. Harold answered honestly, not pretending to be a doctor, but clearly speaking from experience. Alexander listened. He wrote things down, even helped prepare tea one evening, something he never used to do. The mansion slowly adjusted to this new energy. The staff no longer feared making mistakes. They felt comfortable speaking up. Eleanor had more good days than usual. She smiled more. Times she laughed at things that didn't make sense, but the sound of her laughter warmed the rooms. Alexander started leaving his phone in his office more often. He stopped checking emails during dinner. His priorities shifted. The house no longer felt like a stage. It felt like a real place where people lived, felt, and cared for each other. There were still hard moments. Eleanor still had episodes where she cried or panicked, unsure of where she was. But now those moments weren't hidden or treated as shameful. Alexander learned to sit with her quietly, just like Harold did. Sometimes they played old songs, she remembered. Other times they just sat in silence. Harold's quiet leadership had taught Alexander that fixing everything wasn't the goal. Being present was enough. As the days passed, Alexander also began reflecting on his own life. He had always tried to be strong and in control. But now he understood that real strength came from accepting reality, not hiding from it. He thought about how many things he had done for appearances, who he dated, what events he attended, what car he drove. Those things seemed small now. House was no longer about looking impressive. It had become a space where truth could exist, even when it was messy or painful. And that made all the difference. Isabella's absence had changed everything. The mansion, once filled with pressure to perform, was now quiet and peaceful. Alexander, once blind to what was happening in his own home, had finally seen the truth. That single moment of Harold holding Eleanor's hand while sleeping had opened his eyes to everything he had ignored. It showed him what loyalty really meant, and what love looked like without decoration. Harold had never asked for thanks or recognition. He had simply done what was right. That was more powerful than any show of wealth or status. Alexander no longer cared about what people thought of his house or his life. He cared about his mother's comfort, about doing what was right, and about keeping the people who truly mattered close. The mansion, once just a beautiful building, now had real meaning. It was breathing again, not with secrets or appearances, but with honesty and calm. For the first time in a long time, the house finally felt alive. Without Isabella in the house, everything felt different. It was not just quieter, it was lighter. The room seemed easier to be in. The pressure to impress, to act, and to pretend was gone. Alexander made the decision official. He called off the engagement completely. There was no party, no announcement, just a clear decision that he shared with the people who mattered. Of course, the news spread. Some family friends sent messages full of surprise. Others gossiped behind his back. Few even asked if he had gone crazy, but Alexander didn't care anymore. For the first time in years, he was thinking for himself, not for others. His focus shifted completely. He stopped checking social media, avoided public events, and instead spent his time at home. His days were filled with calm routines, checking on his mother, reading, walking through the garden, and watching how Harold worked. He saw him more clearly now, not just as an employee, but as a person who cared. Harold didn't change his behavior, still woke up early, kept the kitchen running, helped the other staff, and spent time with Mrs. Eleanor. But something between him and Alexander had shifted. It wasn't romantic, but it was strong. There was respect now, deep, quiet respect. Alexander began asking his opinion on things. What to serve for meals, how to adjust Eleanor's medicine schedule, and even small changes in the house that might help his mother feel safer. Harold answered simply, always focused on what was best for Eleanor. He never used the new attention to take advantage. He didn't ask for more money, special treatment, or recognition. He just kept doing what was right. Alexander appreciated that more than words could say, realized that loyalty didn't come from promises or titles, it came from actions repeated over time. Isabella had offered him status and comfort, but Harold had given something harder to find. Trust built through honesty and consistency, even during chaos. Eleanor had good and bad days, but the environment helped without Isabella snapping at her or trying to control everything. She relaxed more, she talked more, even if what she said didn't always make sense. She smiled when the staff greeted her. She sat in the sun longer. She hummed old songs that no one remembered. And even though she often forgot names, she remembered feelings. One afternoon, Alexander invited Harold to walk with them in the garden. Eleanor walked between them, holding their arms gently. They moved slowly, stopping to look at flowers and birds. At one point, Eleanor looked up at Harold, smiled, and said softly, "My son." Harold froze for a second, surprised. He looked at Eleanor, who was still smiling. Then he nodded and said, "Yes, I'm here." Alexander watched the moment quietly, saying nothing. He saw how gently Harold held Eleanor's hand, how much it meant to both of them. It wasn't planned or forced, it was real. Harold didn't cry, but he felt something deep inside him. Eleanor calling him son wasn't just a mistake, it was a moment of connection. Maybe Eleanor's memory confused the details, but her heart knew who was safe. Harold didn't correct her, he accepted the title with quiet emotion. Alexander, standing just a few steps behind, understood something important in that moment. He hadn't just lost a fiancée. He had let go of a version of life that was never real. With Isabella, everything had been built on image. Perfect photos, perfect answers, and perfect events. But it had no real foundation. What Harold gave him and gave his mother was different. It wasn't fancy, but it was honest. Watching his mother call Harold son and seeing Harold accept it with grace made something clear in his mind. He had lost something fake, but he had gained something real. It wasn't about what people thought, it was about what truly mattered in the end. Alexander started acting more like the man he wanted to be. He took on more of the daily responsibilities, not because he had to, but because he wanted to be present. He helped Harold set the table. He carried tea to the garden. He sat beside Eleanor while she slept. Sometimes they all watched television together, even if Eleanor didn't follow the story. These small actions built a new type of life inside the house. One with fewer guests, fewer lies, and more meaning. Harold remained the center of it all, kept things running, not just with his hands, but with his presence. His calm energy helped the others feel secure. Alexander even noticed the other staff becoming more relaxed and open. The mansion, once a place of tension and performance, became a place of peace. It didn't need to impress anyone anymore. It just needed to be a home. That home now ran on something stronger than luxury, love, effort, and quiet loyalty. By the end of that week, The mansion had settled into its new rhythm. It was no longer a display of wealth or success. It was a place where people looked each other in the eyes and spoke the truth. Alexander no longer cared about the outside world's opinion. He had finally seen what really made a house into a home. It wasn't the size, the furniture, or the guest list. It was the people inside and the way they treated one another. That peaceful walk in the garden stayed in his memory. Watching his mother smile and call Harold son, seeing Harold accept that with love, it meant more than any engagement ring or expensive event ever could. He had let go of something fake and found something genuine in return. From that day forward, the house was no longer about image. It was about love, about respect, about being loyal. Even when no one was watching, the mansion finally felt honest, finally real. One quiet afternoon, after lunch had been served, and the house had settled into its usual calm, Alexander asked one of the staff to tell Harold he needed to speak with him in his office. Harold paused for a moment when he heard the message. He wasn't used to being called into private meetings, especially not in such a formal way. He wiped his hands on a cloth, fixed his shirt, and walked upstairs unsure of what to expect. When he stepped into the office, Alexander was standing by the window looking thoughtful. He turned, smiled gently, and asked him to sit down. Harold hesitated, then nodded and sat, his hands folded in his lap. Alexander didn't waste time with small talk. "I asked you here because I need to say something important," he began. "Thank you for everything.